Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second lecture in the lecture series, 1,000 Years of Jewish History, featuring Professor Gary Rendsburg of Rutgers University. The informative lecture we had last Thursday was held at Beth El Congregation in Phoenix, and it was also available online. And again, I want to thank Rabbi Steinkokin for helping us putting all together this wonderful collaboration with Beth El Congregation. The lecture tonight and the lecture on December 5th will only be online, as I'm sure you know, and I'm sure everybody will enjoy it just the same. I'm Chavtior Samuelson. I'm the Director of Jewish Studies at ASU, as well as Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and Regents Professor of History. ASU Jewish Studies is committed to public humanities, and we offer lectures on all aspects of the Jewish experience. This, of course, is an example to what we do on other occasions. Our approach is distinctly interdisciplinary, and our faculty members bring to the study of Judaism their expertise in many disciplines, including history, philosophy, religious studies, comparative literature, psychology, sociology, and law. So Professor Rendsburg is similarly committed to interdisciplinary approach or analysis of Jewish history. As you heard last week, his lecture combined the tools of history, archaeology, religious studies, philology, and literary studies. All of this he brought to bear when he interpreted the physical traces and the ideas and texts of the ancient Near Eastern civilization. We really got a kind of a very unusual glimpse into the life, into Jewish life in ancient Babylonia and in Egypt, and it was really fascinating experience. Let me say again a few things about the academic career of Professor Rendsburg. He is the Blanche and Irving Luria Chair in Jewish History at the Department of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University. He also holds a position in the History Department. Professor Rendsburg earned his MA and PhD from New York University. He taught at Canisius College in Buffalo, New York, and then at Cornell for 18 years, and then joined Rutgers in 2004. He's the author of 6 books and over 200 essays, and he writes, publishes on literary approaches to the Bible, the history of the Hebrew language, the history of ancient Israel, and the relationship between ancient Egypt and ancient Israel. And there are other topics as well. He's also very involved in archaeological studies in Israel, excavating places such as Qumran, Tel Do, and Caesarea. So tonight, actually, the focus will be what happened to the Jews after 70 CE. So we're going to shift into different civilizations, I assume, the Greek and the Roman. And we're all looking forward to a very interesting lecture. So please place your questions or comments in the Q&A function. And Professor Rendsburg, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Chava, and thank you to Lisa as well. And it's a pleasure to be back, this time not in person, but from my home in New Jersey. But my visit to Phoenix last week was most memorable, and I just want to thank everybody at ASU and the other venues where I spoke for all their friendship and warm hospitality. And we can continue learning through these other media, such as the Zoom webinar that we're having today. And we'll take next Thursday off for Thanksgiving, but regroup for the third talk on Thursday, December 5th. Right, so 1,000 years of Jewish history. We're trying to do that in 3 weeks. But of course, all we're doing are vignettes. And last week, we spoke about what happened to the Jews after the destruction of the first temple, as the exiles went off to Babylonia or fled in the opposite direction to Egypt. Today, we're going to talk about what happened to the Jews after 70, which of course is the destruction of the second temple. Now, there's a lot more information about this period because the later we get in Jewish history, from the ancient to the late ancient to the medieval and so on, and of course in the modern, we always get more and more information. So we have a lot more to talk about, other than just the Egypt and Babylonia, but also because the Jewish diaspora started to spread even more so after the year 70. The one aspect of the Jewish diaspora which I will not speak about today is the Jews who fled to Arabia to escape the Romans, and that, coming attractions, will be my talk in 2 weeks. So here's the Roman Empire, familiar map to almost everyone, and the province of Judea, as you can see here, was at the far eastern or southeastern end of the Roman Empire. Now, we should point out from the beginning that most Jews were probably content to live under Roman rule as long as they could practice their religion freely, which was always the case, that the temple in Jerusalem operated. The Romans had no problem with the Jews continuing to worship their single deity, but there was a minority movement within Judaism led by the Zealots who believed that the Jews should attempt to become independent from Rome. And that led to the disastrous results of the first revolt, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, the destruction of the temple in 70, and the final battle, the fall of Masada in 73. So what happens to the Jews at this point? So I'm going to talk, because there's only so much one can do in one evening, about the Jews in the diaspora. But I should say at the beginning that Jews remained in the land of Israel. They always did. In time, the center of Jewish life migrated from the environs of Jerusalem to the north, to the Galilee, so that by the 2nd and certainly 3rd century onward, 4th, 5th centuries and so on, what we call the Byzantine period, Jewish life in the land of Israel is most vibrant in the region of the Galilee. But that would be a topic of a whole other time, which we're will not engage with this evening, but I of course needed to mention it. So what about the growing Jewish diaspora? What did the Jews do? Well, I'm going to start by the Jews who fled east, that is to say, away from the Romans. Now, while this map shows you that the area of Mesopotamia was actually within the Roman Empire, it was, but only for about a century, and it's not even clear that they had control over that entire region for the century, because the power to the east that was able to contend with the Romans was the Persian Empire, known as Parthia, as you see on the map. And for a great amount of time, they are actually controlling the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys in Mesopotamia. We're going to start here at the city of Dura Europos, which is on the Euphrates River. Now, it's today on the map, it is in far eastern Syria. It's on the border, very close to the border between Syria and Iraq, so far eastern Syria. It was excavated in the 1930s by a combined team of French archaeologists. Syria was under the French mandate at the time, and archaeologists from Yale University. And it's a marvelous Roman period site. And when they completed the excavations of almost the entire site, there's a 1930s aerial photograph on the right. You can see on the image on the left that it was laid out as a grid, which means that it was being built in a Greek style. The Eastern Mediterranean was Greek culturally, Hellenistic. Italy to the west was more Roman culturally. And I mention this because, if you've been to any city in the Near East, even the old city of Jerusalem or the Khan in Cairo, wherever you may have been, it is a warren of alleyways in which one can easily get lost. But the Hellenistic idea was to build more systematically on the grid. So here is the grid lines of streets and so on with the various buildings that were excavated. I love these photos from the 1930s. I actually showed some last week of excavations elsewhere. So here are the very dusty scenes of excavating a site. Now, at Dura Europos, the archaeologists found both a synagogue and a church. Now, I have actually written the word synagogue larger than church because the synagogue was larger. So we have incipient Christianity. The church was actually more like a meeting place in what looks to be a private home. I'm certainly not expert in that, but that's what the specialists tell us. But the synagogue is clearly a bespoke building built on the western inside. I mean, my arrow doesn't go inside, but where it says L7, inside the walls at the western edge of the city, ditto for that church. This is the synagogue. It is a remarkable structure, which I have never seen, because as you can imagine, I've never been to Syria. And most of my colleagues have never been to Syria. So we study it only from photographs and written reports. The entire synagogue room was moved from the site to the Damascus National Museum, where it still is. So this is the large, what we call the assembly room or the synagogue room. And you can see the niche right here for the keeping of the Torah scrolls. And I don't know if you can make it out here, but you'll see it in a moment. This is a picture of Ezra holding up a scroll of Torah, which of course is prominently placed more or less right above the area where the ark would have been in that niche. Most striking, of course, from this image is the synagogue art. If you've been to Galilean synagogues, the most famous of them like Beit Alpha and others, Tiberias, you have noticed the mosaics on the floor. They are from a century or two after this. This synagogue does not have a mosaic floor with art, but what it does have are these beautiful murals depicting biblical scenes. There's the Torah niche on the left, and the menorah and some other scenes, and on the right, Ezra reading the Torah, looking, of course, rather, Greco-Roman in what looks like a toga of some sort. None of these come with captions, and it is up to us to, of course, determine what scenes we're looking at. Let me just show you a few. And I don't put up text boxes because I want you to take a moment. If we were in real time, or we are in real time, if we were in real space, I might ask you to, okay, audience participation, what are we looking at? What are we looking at, ladies and gentlemen? Well, I think it's pretty clear that this obviously is Moses, baby Moses, being plucked from his little teva, looking like a rectangular box of some sort with a roof, from the Nile by the handmaiden to the princess. Now, you'll see that there are two baby Moseses here. Of course, there's only one baby Moses in the story. I am not an art historian, but I've learned enough to know that this is what we call continuous narrative. In other words, you're supposed to read this like a cartoon, except our cartoons are a series of 3 or 4 boxes. And here you don't have the individual boxes, but you're supposed to read it as if you're going through time. So the woman in the Nile plucking the baby and then handing it to somebody who's handing it to the princess. And somebody here is supposed to be Miriam, presumably, and somebody here may also be Moses' mother, Yocheved. So that's one scene. What are we looking at here? Not as well preserved, a king on a throne, assumed to be King David, not impossible that it would be King Solomon, but assumed to be King David, the greatest king in the tradition. And what are we looking at here? Well, there's only one place in the entire Bible where somebody rides on a horseback. And the answer is Mordechai being paraded through the town in the book of Esther. So these are just some of the scenes. So you imagine yourself in this synagogue looking at this beautiful artwork all around you. This is the schematic drawing. The line that you see below the line is all preserved. And above the line, of course, we don't know what was there. More scenes, no doubt, to give you a sense of this incredible synagogue, dated to the 2nd and 3rd century. I didn't say that up until now. So this is, within not the first generation of the Jews who left the land of Israel and moved east to Mesopotamia to live along the shore of the Euphrates River, but at least the 2nd or 3rd generation are building this synagogue. And there it is again. I direct your attention to the ceiling. There are ceiling tiles, which is more of the art of the synagogue. Many of them are still in situ in Damascus, as you see here, but some of them, which had sort of fallen during the excavations, were brought to Yale University. This is an old black and white photo of it. I couldn't find a color one looking straight up, but it shows you the designs of, geometrics and some animals and plants. And notice the inscriptions. right? Do you see the inscriptions? These are dedicatory inscriptions of the donors to the synagogue. And of course, we all like to joke, nothing's changed in 2,000 years. You contribute funds to the construction of the synagogue, you get your name on a donor plaque. In this case, they're up on the ceiling. And here's one up close from the Yale University collection. It's a bird and some sort of a wreath and a bird and some, I don't know, grape cluster or something like that, just to give you a sense. Now, we love art. Everybody loves art. But of course, what most scholars who deal with antiquity like more than anything else is the written word, myself included. One fragmentary parchment document was found at Dura Europos in 2 pieces, as you can see here. And it is a liturgical prayer concerning the eating of meat. It's actually in the Beinecke Library at Yale. So it's not Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals, which one recites after having eaten bread. It's not any of the other known Jewish liturgical prayers that we know from the rabbinic tradition, which one recites after eating other foods. It's simply a prayer that was used in conjunction with the eating of meat, either before or after. And here is a translation of a transcription and a translation of it. So you can see the top line, Baruch, if you can read Hebrew, what the Aleph may stand for, maybe Atah, maybe somehow substituting for the divine name, Melech HaOlam, ruler of the universe. And you can see words, if you know Hebrew, in the 3rd line, Basar and Behemah. So you get the word for meat and you get the word for cattle or animal. Yatzar, Adam le'achol, right? So that he created for man to eat. And this is the prayer that they recited. It's a piece of Jewish liturgy that otherwise was lost to us and never found anywhere else. So a nice little a side note to the beautiful artwork that dominates that synagogue. Now, it may come as a surprise that many Jews actually decided to stay within the Roman Empire, but to move to more peaceful areas of the Roman Empire where there wouldn't be revolts. So this is after the year 70, but as per the title of my talk. But let's also remember that there was a second revolt in 132 to 135 called the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was also disastrous and naturally suppressed by the Roman legions. And it's very possible that after the second revolt, even more Jews left the land and said, you know, there are some pretty peaceful areas in the Roman Empire where we could prosper. Let's move there. So we're now looking to the Greek world, which today we associate with the area where it says Athens to the west of the Aegean. But in antiquity, the Greek world is on both sides of the Aegean. There are no Turks yet. Turkey doesn't exist until the Middle Ages. So it's Greek on both sides of the Aegean, and to that region, Jews will travel. Now, one of the ways we know that there are Jews in various places is due to the presence of synagogues. Synagogues had been established in the 3rd century B.C.E. in Egypt, especially in the area around Alexandria, which you can actually see on this map. And they had spread into the land of Israel even while the temple was standing. There's a synagogue at Jericho, there's a synagogue at Gamla, there's a synagogue at Magdala. The temple was standing, and there were already synagogues in the land as a parallel way to worship God, not through animal sacrifice, but through communal gathering and prayer and reading of Torah and so on. But after the destruction of the temple, especially in the Diaspora, but even within the land of Israel, as you can imagine, synagogues burgeon everywhere. You see Dura Europos there, the furthest one to the east on the Euphrates. This map is intentionally the Diaspora, so there are none in the land of Israel, but that's not because there weren't any, it's because we're looking in the Diaspora here. And we're going to focus on 3 different places. Sardis, which is in modern-day Western Turkey, a remarkable archaeological site. Corinth, near Athens, and Stobi, which is in the region of Macedonia. So if we go to Sardis, which is the best preserved of all of them, this is the outer courtyard of the synagogue at Sardis. This was excavated over the years by a joint team of Harvard and Cornell. When I got to Cornell in 1986, most of the excavation was over, but some of my colleagues were still working on the material then. And here is the synagogue room. Every excavation is going to reveal random discoveries, which is to say, in this case, we don't have a lot of walls, but we do have the floor, or a good portion of the floor. And you can see a few, we'll call them installations, which we'll look at up close. This would have to be a wealthy community to afford a mosaic floor like the one you're looking at here. This kind of design on the wall, which is presumably behind, this is where the focal point of the congregation would most likely have been looking in this direction. And just look at some of these, beautifully preserved marble and inlays that you get in the Sardis synagogue. I always like to say, as I said earlier, I'm not an art historian, but I think all of us can delight in these beautiful productions. Presumably, this is the reader's table, a nice big flat piece of marble, supported on these stone pedestals with lion's feet, as you can see, and an eagle on the side. And to the right, you actually see the double lion right here, and a portion of the mosaic floor. What function this would have had, we don't know. Probably just decorative. Also found at the Sardis synagogue was a menorah. Now, this was published, this was an earlier discovery. It was published quite a while ago. And we don't have any pictures of the menorah. I have never been able to find them. I've consulted with others. Nobody seems to have good photos of it. But we do have the original publication with the line drawing, so we can get an understanding of what it looked like. Anything that you see in the drawing is real. That's actually what was found. The white, meaning the base, and the rest of the inscription up here was lost, but we can reconstruct it pretty well. And bits and pieces of the inscription fell off, so they may have been along here, but they just put them up there just to show you in this drawing what it looked like. Why am I showing you this? Well, it's always wonderful to see a menorah, but also because of the one word that we can read, if you can read Greek. And it's not just a word, it's actually the name of the person who no doubt donated this menorah. And what's striking is his name is Socrates. Now, Socrates, the great classical Greek philosopher who lived, 5th century BCE, 700, 800, 900 years prior to this, was not a common name among Greeks. But somehow some Jewish family in the 2nd or 3rd, call it 3rd or 4th century CE, decided they were so Hellenized and so loving Hellenistic culture apparently, that they decided to name their son Socrates, who grew up to no doubt be a relatively wealthy person and was able to donate the menorah to the synagogue. It's a great, great, great piece of archaeological find. If we move to Corinth near Athens, another synagogue, and there's a frieze, and you see the 3 exemplars of the menorah here, and also a lintel inscription. It's broken. Welcome to the world of archaeology. And the letters that we can read right here, which I've transcribed down here, if you know, I always like to tell my students, you all have to know the Greek alphabet, and you just walk up and around our campus and see all the fraternity houses and sorority houses. You should at least be able to read the letters. Gamma, Omega, Gamma, Eta, Epsilon, Beta, Rho, which equivalents more or less to what I've written down here in our English alphabet. And the reconstruction of this is the synagogue of the Hebrews, right? Synagogue Hebreon. In other words, we have the end of the word for synagogue, which is a Greek word, right? Synagogue means place of gathering. It's a Greek word. More or less a direct translation of Hebrew Beit Knesset, or the other way around. Hebrew Beit Knesset is a more or less translation of the Greek word synagogue. And in Greek, they use the word Hebrews as often as they use the word Jews. So a lintel inscription, of course, telling us what we're looking at, in addition to the other piece that I showed you with the 3 menorot. And but by the way, at Corinth, not a lot of archaeology of a synagogue, only this lintel and the 3 menorot. So you, as I said, it's somewhat random I don't have a picture of the synagogue itself. But if we go to Stobi in Macedonia to the north, in the deeper into the Balkans, again, another synagogue, in this case with pillars remain standing. Yes, we're into the 4th and 5th century, but these Jews didn't arrive probably in the 4th century and just build this. Any community that's building a synagogue of this size, and I'll even use the word grandeur, you can get a sense of how high the ceiling was, how high the roof line was. They probably didn't arrive in the 4th century. They may not have been there in the 1st century, immediately after 70, but one can imagine that a community would have been here in the 2nd or 3rd century, establishing themselves, growing, and so on until they get a synagogue like the one that you see here. These are just all absolutely marvelous. And there's the 3 sites again. Now, let's go to Rome. If we go back here, you'll see the city of Rome. And next to it is the site of Ostia. If you look at the legend, I mean, everything's in French here, but that's fine. The stars on the map are examples where we actually have the archaeology of the synagogue, right? So we know it's there. Although in some cases, we also have a reference where it says literature. That means we actually have a reference to know there was a synagogue in Sardis and in Corinth from some text here or there, beyond the archaeology. So in this case, the literature references override and they get the blue dots. When we only have the archaeology, like at Stobi or Ostia, we rely on the archaeology to flesh out the story for us. So yes, Jews also went to Rome. Now, there was a Jewish community in Rome as early as the 1st century B.C.E., perhaps even the 2nd century B.C.E., an incipient community, Jews who would have understood that Rome was the great power and that there is economic benefit to living in the capital city of a great empire, and that they could, of course, be engaged in Mediterranean trade, especially products from the Near East, which they knew well, such as wine and olive oil and spices and so on. And so there is a Jewish community in Rome prior to the year 70. But of course, what happens in the year 70, to punish the Jews for their revolt, the Roman emperors bring the Jews to Rome as slaves. So there's a whole new community, not under the best conditions, obviously, which arrives in Rome after the year 70. To remind us of the emperors of the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian, who was the Roman general putting down the revolt, who in 69 was called back to Rome to become emperor, and therefore was succeeded by his son Titus, who now is the general in Israel, while Vespasian rules in Rome. When Vespasian dies, his son Titus succeeds him as emperor, but it only lives for a few years, and then he is succeeded by his brother Domitian. So those are the 3 famous names, especially Vespasian and Titus, of this time period. And they would be responsible, Vespasian as emperor, Titus as general, after the year 70, to bring the Jews back to Rome as slaves. Now, everybody knows this picture, but not everybody knows what I'm going to tell you. Look at the years when the Colosseum was built. The Colosseum was built during the years in Rome, in central Rome. How many of you have been? Raise your hand. To yourselves, raise your hand. The Colosseum was built during the year 72 to 80. And we know from the documentation that it was actually built by Jewish slaves. In other words, it's built during the reign of Emperor Vespasian. This is not a coincidence. There is new slave labor that is brought to Rome in large numbers, and we can put them to work, the Roman emperors say, right, to build what will become the great sporting arena for Rome. If you go there today, and I assume many of you have been there, there is signage all about it. You may not have seen the signage, you may have missed it. It's relatively prominent. It's both in Italian and in English, and it tells you that in AD 72, Emperor Vespasian used the spoils of his Jewish campaign to build Rome's first permanent amphitheater to host hunting spectacles and gladiatorial combats, right? So it's right there in the opening line. Yes, the Colosseum was built by newly imported Jewish slaves to Rome. And then famously, this does not have to do so much with what happened to the Jews after 70, but everybody knows this iconic photo as well. When Titus becomes emperor, it actually is constructed in the last year of his life. When Titus becomes emperor, he builds the Arch of Titus, and right up here on the upper left, as you face it in this direction, is the famous panel depicting the spoils of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, because Titus, of course, was the general who had conquered Jerusalem, his father already emperor. And there you have that famous panel. We can go up and see it. People are working on it today, still a new project to study it more up close and personal, with scaffolding and getting good photos and looking at details of it that you cannot see if you're standing far below. Roman soldiers carrying off the spoils of war, most prominently the menorah, but other items associated with the temple, including the chatzotzrot, the horns that you see on the right, and other smaller items which are a little bit more difficult to see here. So that's the famous story of the Arch of Titus. And I think I will pause right here for a moment. Yes, we will pause for a moment. And we're a half hour in. And let me just invite you to ask any questions. Lisa is monitoring the questions in the Q&A. And if any have arrived, we will have plenty of time at the end for all questions. But I'll ask Lisa if anybody has anything to ask about the first half hour of my presentation.
So far, no. Oh, here, one just popped up. Okay, let's see. How significant in Jewish history was the Romanote? Is that right?
Romaniot, yeah.
Okay. Jews who went to Greece after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE.
Right. Thank you for asking that question, because I didn't mention them. But when you look at the synagogues of Sardis, Corinth, and Stobi, which I showed, those are what we later call the Romaniot Greek community. So let me explain. After the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, many of the Jews from Spain went to the other end of the Mediterranean, the eastern end of the Mediterranean, where they were invited by the Ottoman Sultan. And Jews flood in large numbers into the Ottoman Empire, living in Istanbul itself, Salonika, Rhodes, Izmir, those would be around the Aegean, but also settling in the land of Israel. The community in Sfat gets underway at that point, for example, which was all within the Ottoman Empire. And you know, going to Damascus and Aleppo and wherever. But the Romanio Jews, and they become the larger number of Greek Jews, speaking Ladino. The original Greek Jewish community we call Romaniot because they go back to the Roman period. So Greek Jewry from, let's say, 1500 onward is split between the real Sephardic Ladino-speaking Jews and the older, much older community of Greek-speaking Romanio Jews who have their own Greek Jewish liturgy, which is different from the Sephardic one that was brought from Spain. I hope everybody understood that, right? That's the complicated history of the Greek Jewish community. And the Greek Jews, if they are Ladino-speaking Jews in Salonika and so on, are of course exceedingly proud of their heritage. And the Romanio Jews are exceedingly proud of their heritage because they know they go back to the origins of Greek Jewry in the period immediately after 70. Right? So yes, great question.
Okay, the next question actually is, is someone who's concerned about how do these ruins make it through all of these hostile governments that exist within the countries that they're in?
Well, the only one that actually is in a hostile government would be Syria. Right, the Dura Europos one, the first one that I showed.
Right. Well, Turkey may or not be.
No,
May.
Turkey preserves all of its archaeology. Greece, obviously, Italy, obviously, they preserve all their archaeology. There are no issues in any of these countries. The only one would be Syria, but the Syrian government continues to protect the synagogue in the National Museum in Damascus. Now, having said that, I should tell you that I believe there were reports 5-6 years ago of ISIS destroying the archaeological site of Dura Europos. So I showed you pictures of the excavation before ISIS came in and destroyed things. And they did that in a number of sites. Trust me, on the Iraqi side of the border, Iraq preserves its archaeology, and on the Syrian side of the border, they preserve their archaeology. It's only these extremist groups like ISIS and in Afghanistan, the Taliban and so on, who go around destroying archaeological sites. So that's my answer to the question. Yeah. Doesn't mean we're safe to visit them. You know, I wouldn't travel to Syria or Iraq, but you get a sense. Okay. One more question? Yeah.
Okay. Well, the next two questions are very similar. So one is, did Josephus report on any of this? And then one other person said, Josephus wrote that Jews lived in the area of Spain for hundreds of years before him.
Right. Okay. So I'm not sure about the Spain thing. And if he said hundreds of years, I'd have to track that down. There were at the very end. I will come back to that. Okay. But as far as Josephus, yes, Josephus reports on a good part of this, and thank you for raising the question because it reminds me to say that the great Jewish historian Josephus, who witnessed the events of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, actually goes to Rome as well, not as a slave. He becomes an honored, we could almost call it citizen of Rome, because those Roman emperors, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, actually grant Josephus the freedom to write the history. They set him up in a library in Rome, and he writes his great works in Greek, the history of the Jews and the Jewish war, in which he details many of the events of the time period, which we still possess today. He's living in Rome, but he's writing in Greek. Educated Romans all knew Greek. Josephus, having grown up in the Eastern Mediterranean, was trilingual, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Probably learned Latin to negotiate the streets of Rome, but he was composing in Greek. And so his voluminous writings are precious frequently eyewitness accounts to the events of the first century. So he will speak about a number of these issues as well. Yeah. Okay, great questions. As I said, we'll have plenty of time at the end, but let's move on with our story. We're staying in Rome. So there were Jews in Rome, as we've seen. And although they may have come as slaves, again, within a century or so, this is where we don't have all the documentation, but by the 2nd century or 3rd century, there's a flourishing Jewish community in Rome. It's still the Roman Empire. Christianity is actually the persecuted group more than the Jews. And at the site of Ostia Antica, which is on the Tiber River right before it flows into the Mediterranean. In other words, Rome, for those of you who've been, will know that Rome is inland from the Mediterranean. It is not a port city. I mean, the ships could navigate the Tiber as far as Rome, relatively small ships in those years. But the great port city was Ostia Antica, or Ostia for short, Antica meaning ancient. And there was a vibrant Jewish community, again, probably engaged in the maritime trade, especially because they would have had co-religionists in the Aegean and in the land of Israel and in Egypt and so on. This synagogue was discovered in the 1960s. And in this case, we don't get much of a floor, but we have wonderful columns and we have the bema. So you have the stairs right here going up to the bema. So, you know, and we then, and bits of what I'll call the ceiling and the roof. So every synagogue gives us a little bit more. Every excavation site gives us a little bit more. Okay, there is a mosaic floor, not on the synagogue itself, but off to the side. And that installation that you see there is a communal oven. So not everybody had a personal oven at home. Most homes shared a courtyard and had an oven, but the Jewish community here had a communal oven. And you could bring your dough and bake in the synagogue oven. Here's the view in the other direction. By the way, Ostia is an enormous archaeological site. In the distance, you see more columns, and so on. It probably takes 2 hours to walk through the whole thing. I mean, it's not Pompeii, but which would take 2 weeks, but it's a very large site. So this is the back of the bema area that you see here. Now we're in the synagogue itself. Not much to look at. So again, but the bema itself is, remarkable. So that this is one of the colonnades holding at the bema, and if you look up to the ceiling, you can see there's a menorah there. So this is called a capital. The head, the top, capital meaning basically head in Latin. It's the top of the column, and then it's holding up a ceiling which has remained, much of it has fallen, but parts of it have remained with a menorah here and on the other one as well. So here's an artist drawing. This is what I was just showing you right here. And there's one on this side too. And here's those steps I showed you. So here's an artist rendering of what the bema looked like. You see the rounded thing on the back that I showed you? And on that stone structure, most likely was a wooden ark, which has been imagined, as you see here, with cubicles holding scrolls, right? There are no Torah scrolls of the sort that we think of today, which stand vertically and so on, both in the Ashkenazi and Sephardic traditions. Most likely the scrolls just were laid in cubicles. That's the way things were stored in ancient libraries, in the Greek world, in the Roman world. And it's not even clear if they would have had a 5-book Torah, right? Genesis through Deuteronomy. We know from rabbinic literature that many scrolls were just read singularly. You read Genesis, put it back when you were done, read Exodus, and so on. In the words of the rabbis, we have Torah either as a 5-volume set, meaning a single scroll like all Jews use today, or to use the rabbinic term, Megillah, scroll by scroll for the 5 scrolls. So that's probably what we're looking at here in this artist rendering, because it doesn't show the huge scroll. Here I am with my colleague. I just want to thank my very generous colleague, Father Craig Morrison, OCARM, meaning Order of the Carmelites. He's Canadian, but he's been living in Rome for 30 years. He is a dean at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. And in February, March 2023, so basically a year and a half ago, I was invited by Father Morrison to be a visiting professor at the Pontifical Biblical Institute, where I taught a mini course to an international array of students. This is all side comments. But those 2 months in Rome allowed me to spend a lot more time visiting the Jewish sites, including the Synagogue of Ostia. And Craig and I went out there by train one day. You can walk there from the train station. And this gives you another view of the bema and those pillars holding up the 2 ceiling parts with the minaret. Is everybody just fascinated by this? I mean, this is just incredible, right? Now, why am I showing you this picture? Do you see the cars in the distance? Okay, right here. How was this synagogue found? Well, it's on the edge of the great archaeological site of Ostia, but they hadn't gotten this far yet in the excavations. So if we look, and there's more cars coming around the bend. If you look at your Google map, you see the roadway. So the Italians were building a new road to connect Rome to the airport. And while they were building the road, they hit the stones. And of course, just like in Israel, right? If you hit a stone, you can't keep constructing. You call in the archaeological authorities, And the roadway today, do you see how the way it loops around the synagogue so that they could preserve the synagogue? This is the main archaeological section of the town. Here's the synagogue, but all this we know is archaeological as well, because you can still see some stones here and there. It just hasn't been excavated yet. And you see the Tiber River just before it flows into the Mediterranean. So here, Fiumicino, those of you who've been to Rome, right here is the airport. And here's that road they were building. So that's how this was discovered, 1961, 62, when they called in the archaeologists, who very quickly realized that this was a synagogue, right? So these are the places you should put on your list of places to visit. Highly recommend next time you're in Rome, a trip out to Ostia, easy to get to by train. Now, Jews in the Roman Empire. We're going to come back to Rome, we're not done. But I want to show you where else Jews went in the Roman Empire. They went to the northern reaches of the Roman Empire in what I would call out-of-the-way places. Pannonia is a Roman province bordered by the Danube River in more or less modern-day Austria, which formed the northern boundary of the Roman Empire. This is the map of Austria today. And in the far eastern edge of Austria, along the border with Hungary, is a village called Haupttorn. Nobody ever heard of it. This is Vienna right here. Okay, nobody ever heard of Haupttorn. But archaeologists from the University of Vienna, 20 years ago, decided let's excavate. What were they looking for? Well, Roman period stuff, right? After all, it's the Roman Empire, it's the border. We'll find a Roman fort, we'll find something. Well, this is the countryside, just to give you a sense of what it looks like. They found graves from around the year 200. And in one of the graves, they found this gold amulet. This is a really blown up photo. It looks big on your screens. It's 2.2 centimeters high and about 2 centimeters across, right? Each of these little things here is a millimeter. So it's 2 centimeters across and 2.2 centimeters high. And it had Greek letters. It's a gold amulet you put in the grave, right, to protect the deceased in the afterlife, presumably. Well, the archaeologists are, field archaeologists, and they can study, the things that archaeologists find, pottery and metal, coins and so on. But everybody's a specialist, and they probably had some basic Greek, but they couldn't read this. I mean, they could read the letters. So this is a transcription of it. It's gibberish in Greek. And they gave it to their colleagues in the classics department at the University of Vienna and said, what is this? And they were stumped as well until somebody figured out what it is. It's the Shema prayer in Hebrew, but written out in Greek letters. In other words, if I wrote out to you, and some Jewish prayer books put key passages like the Shema in transliteration, right? S-H-E-M-A, space, Y-S-R-A-E-L for Yisrael, and so on. These are the Greek letters which say, there's no sh in Greek, so it is an S sound, Shema Israel, Adonai, Elo, Adon. And he ran out of room, so instead of writing a chad, he wrote an alpha, which is like Hebrew, aleph for the numeral 1. So there you have, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, the Shema prayer, written out in Greek letters on a gold amulet found in a Roman period grave. What's going on here? This is all the evidence we have. I don't have any other evidence to show you. I don't have a Jewish this or a Jewish that or a menorah or a synagogue or anything to show you. But almost undoubtedly, this is a Jewish person, perhaps in the Roman army around the year 200, or a merchant living in that region who was buried with this little gold amulet. There's somebody holding it there. The real one is there on the right to give you a sense again of how small it is, and a blown up photo of it on the left. The Hauptturn amulet, accordingly, has changed all of our knowledge about everything in the last 10 to 20 years. It's one tiny piece of evidence. We don't have anything beyond that. But presumably it is evidence of Jewish life in the Roman province of Pannonia. No surprise to find Jews in Rome and Greece and Egypt and so on, but that's pretty far north. But it also helps explain, there it is again, it also helps explain something which we always knew about, but we were also puzzled by. I am now going to show you evidence for Jews in Cologne, Germany, in the 4th century CE. This is something we've always known. It's been an outlier. How did Jews get to Cologne on the Rhine River in the Rhineland, so far north, so far from Judea, in the 4th century? How do we know that they're there? So this is a document. This is the time of Constantine the Great. Emperor Constantine rules for 3 decades in the early part of the 4th century. And this is not this is not his original decree. This is a medieval manuscript. It's in the Vatican Library in Rome, and it is a manuscript which collects all of the decrees and letters and so on of Emperor Constantine. So this would have been passed down for 700-800 years. I'm not sure when this is dated to, but it gives you all of, it's like it's an archival collection of copies of copies of copies, which eventually would have gone back to Emperor Constantine. And famously, in the year 321, it's dated, famously in the year 321, the first Christian emperor issued a decree allowing Jews to serve on the Curia, that is to say, the town council of the city of Cologne. Now, we'll talk about this next week again when we get to Arabia. If a Jew is a candidate to serve on the town council in Cologne, he probably did not arrive in December of 321, right? We know the patterns of immigration from one country to another. Probably he might be the descendant of somebody who was there in the 3rd century, sometime in the 200s. And a generation or two later, some, Jew of some substance or political import or economic import is a candidate to serve on the town council. So that's the famous decree of Constantine. If you can read your Greek letters, Judeos, Jews, right there. And how did they get there? Well, we only have one thing from Constantine in 321, and we have one gold amulet from Pannonia in around 200. But this is what we historians do. We build an entire narrative out of just little bits and pieces of evidence because that's all we have. And we just continue to work on to the best of our ability with the small bits of evidence we have. But it shows us that there are Jews in the northern reaches of the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Let's go back to Rome, which will be the final piece of our presentation today. The Ostia Synagogue, which is 2nd, 3rd century. The next piece of evidence we have are the Jewish catacombs of Rome in the 3rd and 4th centuries. So this map shows you the squares are Jewish catacombs. I've put here the 2 dots. This is the for those of you who know Rome, this is the Vatican here, and this is the Colosseum here, just to give you some bearings. This is the old city walls of Rome. Some of it, almost none of it is still there. There are a few gates here and there, but you see that the Jewish catacombs, and the round ones are Christian. In the south there you see a bunch, and some up in the north. Catacombs are mainly outside the city. Now for Jews that would be normal because Jews buried outside the city. Christians frequently buried in the church crypt, but these are Christian catacombs, some of them in the same neighborhoods more or less as the Jewish catacombs. We're going to start with Villa Torlonia. Only one of these is open to the public, and this is the one down here, the last one I think I'll show you, Vigna Randanini. That's open to the public. That's the one I've been into. You have to go with a certified tour guide. But there are plans to open up the Villa Torlonia in the next year, and it may already be opening up. I haven't followed the full narrative of when that one will open up. This is inside those catacombs. Burial chambers with frescoes. About 120, hundreds of graves, but about 120 of them have inscriptions. Almost all of them in Greek, some in Latin, a few in Hebrew. Again, if we were all together, I'd say to you, how many of you have been to Beit Sha'arim? right? Beit Sha'arim, which is the great catacombs in the north of Israel, don't have any frescoes like this. It's a fantastic site that everybody should visit, but it's more or less contemporary with the catacombs at Beit Sha'arim. And even in this image, you can see the menorah here on the ceiling at the top, here, over here, Jewish symbols everywhere. Why Greek? Again, these Jews, they're all speaking Latin by this point. Greek was the prestige language, especially for the more cosmopolitan people, both among the Romans and certainly amongst the Jews, whose origins, of course, came from the Eastern Mediterranean. How's that for a beautiful painted chamber? Menorah, ark, and so on. On the right there, I see an etrog, a little vial of olive oil, right? If you've been to Beit Sha'arim or Tiberias or Sepphoris, which are the three best preserved synagogue mosaic floors, they have very similar artwork from more or less the same time period, right? Okay. Everybody like the little flames coming out of the tops of the oil lamps? I mean, these are the things you should be, looking at here. In some cases, just burial niches, no inscriptions, nothing, but gives you a sense how people were buried. Here's an inscription. This man is called a grammateus, which has from which our English word grammar comes. It means a person who has the knowledge of a language or books. It's probably the equivalent of a Hebrew sofer, a scribe, or an educated person. But they're using this word grammateus. And look at the artwork on top from the right. Etrog, menorah, then skip. Not sure what that is on the left, and then a shofar. So what is this? Now, there are 12 round things here with these things on either side, right? So some people think, that's a depiction of the 12 loaves of bread that were kept in the temple when the temple stood. But others have suggested, because he's a grammateus, that this is an ark, that the doors open and you're looking at 12 scrolls, like we saw in the reconstruction of the Ostia Bema. We don't know for sure. I like the second one. I really like the second idea better. And, psalm singer, lover of the law, so he was the Chazan, right? Maybe. Okay. We go to Monteverde, site of 200 different Jewish burial inscriptions, most of them now housed in the Vatican Museum, which I'll show you in a moment. These were found as early as the 17th century, although mostly in the 18th century. In other words, the people of Rome knew they were sitting on an archaeological treasure, and there were early excavations. If you don't know this, by the way, the excavations of Pompeii started in the 18th century, almost 250 years ago. They started the excavations of Pompeii. Now that's, further south of Naples. But this gives you a sense of, we think of archaeology as a 19th, 20th century thing associated especially with the heyday of the British Empire. But people were doing archaeology, especially in Italy, early on. So the neighborhood of Monteverde, on the other side of the Tiber River, we have all sorts of inscriptions. Again, these catacombs are off limits. This person is called the archon, meaning the leader of the synagogue. Okay? ARCH in English, right? Like archbishop, archangel, right? All of that Greek word archon means the leader. So this is like the archbishop and the archangel. This is the archon of the synagogue of the people of Tripoli, right? So there would have been a separate synagogue in Rome for the community of Jews from Tripoli, which is a city in Libya, okay? And the menorah there, you see. These have all been collected. If you see the name at the bottom of these images, David Noy, an English scholar, has collected all of these in his great book, and I just keep my parentheses there to remind myself if I have to look them up. He describes them, translates them, and so on. Simply a person named Aster, that's all, person's name, nothing else. Menorah and birds, very pretty. So these stones were taken out of the walls of the catacombs to be on display in the museum. Very sad to see a 7-month-old die, but how nice to see a Jewish woman living to the age of 85. back in, we'll call it the 3rd or 4th century. Okay. The upshot of this, of course, there were Jews everywhere in the Mediterranean, right? I mean, and everywhere in the Roman Empire, right? Another one gives you a sense of all of these. Just a name and half of a menorah, right? The other half of the stone is gone, but you can see half the menorah there. Interesting, this woman is called a priestess. Now, there are no priestesses in Judaism, but if you were to translate the Greek word here, herika, that would mean something like priestess. Is she a bat Kohen? Is she the daughter of a Kohen? Probably. We just don't know, other than the fact that she gets a title which, if you had to translate the Greek word, would come in as priestess. Another individual, look at their names, very few Hebrew names, right? They're using Greek names and Latin names. But they love their menorah. I didn't say this yet, I need to say this. The menorah was the single most important symbol of Jewish art for hundreds of years. The Star of David is not. Star of David doesn't become a Jewish symbol until the late Middle Ages. In fact, in the early Middle Ages, it's used by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. It doesn't become associated with Jews, and then even much more so, especially because it's the symbol on the flag of the modern state of Israel. But you don't look for the 6-pointed star, Magen David, when you look at ancient art. You're looking for the menorah to find Jews. And another one, nice good age of 80. A few more of these. Now we go, Trastevere, which you see on the map right across the Tiber from, in fact, the Jewish ghetto, the so-called Jewish ghetto of today. It's not a ghetto anymore, but the Italians still actually call it the ghetto. The Italian Jews still call it the ghetto. The great synagogue, if you've been there, is right here. Okay. These were also discovered in the 17th and 18th century. And a few more found in 1744, right? It's in the Vatican Museum. I like this one because it has shalom written across the bottom 4 times. They remembered their Hebrew, right? So you've got Latin and Greek, and then, they knew enough Hebrew to write the word shalom 4 times, which is wonderful. Here they are all on display in the Vatican Museum. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have visited the Vatican Museum, which is so crowded, as you know, and you get, it's a horde that gets moved along as you walk through the museum, looking at all manner of stuff. You really don't have time to pause. This picture obviously was taken when the museum was opened by the professional staff there. But this gives you a sense. Many of the ones that I just showed you are here hanging on these walls. And it's more extensive than this even. And finally, we come to the one that I've actually been to because it's open to the public, the Vigna Randonini. And it's right next to the Christian catacombs of San Sebastiano. And they almost abut each other, although there's the Via Appia runs right through it. How's everybody's Italian? Vigna means vineyard. So in the 19th century, the Randonini family, which owns this land, they were like expanding their vineyard or something. And they found, while digging or whatever, oh, look at this. There are catacombs beneath us on a hillside. And so, again, archaeologists were brought in, and today it is open to the public. So these are now all my photos. This is the entranceway. You see the hillside up above, which is very similar to Beit Sha'arim, right? I mean, Chava, I know you've been, right? So the hillside above, and you've got the entrance to the catacombs below. This is obviously modern construction to, allow for tourists. You go in that door, and this is what you see: niches everywhere. To walk the entire thing takes an hour and a half probably. I mean, it is so extensive, with fingers and new passageways and so on. Here and in the other places, although I just haven't been to them, they have kept most of the inscriptions are still in the wall. They have not removed them, which is great because you can actually walk in and see them. Another person called a grammateos. Okay. If you want to read along a little bit here, by the way, Both in Latin and in Greek, you don't do this in Hebrew, but both in Latin and in Greek, they don't have hyphens, and they'll just carry a word from one line. So here's the person's name, Deutero, and then they just carry the G-R-A-M-A-T. Everybody see that? Grammate. They just carry it over into the next line. Hebrew scribes never did that. You had to end a word at a line and then start the next word on the next line. But in the Greco-Roman tradition, both in Greek and Latin, you could do that. Another grammateus, and his spouse named Julia, right here, Julia. I love that because our 4-year-old granddaughter is named Julia. Okay, so Julia. So this will be her bat mitzvah invitation, no doubt, in 8 years. And what is that showing at the bottom? Well, don't you just love the way we read into all of this, right? How about a Torah scroll opened up? He's a grammateus, right? He's a person of the written word. And maybe those are supposed to show columns of a Torah scroll. We don't know, but there you have it. And finally, if you can't make it to Rome, next time you're in New York, the Jewish Museum in New York on Upper Fifth Avenue has a single plaque from the Vigna Randinini catacombs. I'm not sure how it got to the Jewish Museum. Most of its stuff is in situ and or in Roman museums, including the Vatican Museum. But you see the large menorah, and I see a lulav and etrog, and a vessel and a shofar, and so on. And those are the dimensions there, about 30 centimeters high. So you're getting a sense of the size of these plaques. And there are simply Jewish communities everywhere in the Roman Empire. There's only so much one can do in an hour-plus talk. So I have not shown you, for example, the Jewish communities across North Africa in what this map calls Egypt, Cyrene, Carthage, which is today Tunisia. Well, Carthage had been destroyed by then, but in the area across North Africa, there would have been Jewish communities. And we know that during this time period in the Western Mediterranean, and this goes back to the question during the break, in the Western Mediterranean, there's already a Jewish community in Marseille by, let's say, the 2nd century CE, and certainly in Spain by the 2nd century CE as well. We'll call it Iberia. It's not quite Spain yet. The question was, Josephus mentioning Jewish communities in Iberia even earlier than his day. I'll have to check on that. It's very possible that he mentions it. It's very possible that it's historically accurate. If you don't rebel against the Roman Empire, it's a great place to live because there's economic opportunity for trade during what we call the Pax Romana, the peace that the Romans could bring to the entire region. So that is our Jews mainly in the Roman Empire, although we started with Dura. And because I have the map up before we conclude, coming attractions for 2 weeks from this evening, we'll talk about the Jews who went to Arabia. And you will be shocked. I do hope you'll join us in 2 weeks. You will be shocked to learn how much archaeological material we have of the Jews in Arabia starting in the 2nd century and burgeoning in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries. Coming attractions for next time. For now, I say Toda. Thank you very much. Happy to take all the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot. Can I pose a question before we get to other
Of course.
questions? I'm interested. I never thought of it until now, but you're suggesting that Latin was used by Jews in those early centuries, but we don't have Jewish texts in Latin, do we, from this period?
Almost none. Well, some of these inscriptions are in Latin. Look, if they're living in Rome, and the academy spoke Greek. The higher, elevated culture was Greek. But in the marketplace, when you went to the market, you had to speak Latin. But we don't have a lot of Judeo-Latin material. You're correct. We have Judeo-Greek. Later on, we'll have Judeo-Italian, etc. And Judeo-Arabic, of course. But we don't have a lot of Judeo-Latin material. But we have inscriptions. We don't have any, so yes, they would have had to use Latin. In Cologne, in the northern reaches of the Roman Empire, they would have been using Latin. And by the way, for those of you, who don't know this, Cologne, the Germans call their own city Cologne. The French call it Cologne, but the old Roman name for it is Colonia, which just means colony. Right? It was their great colony in the northern reaches of the empire, which they established to control the Rhine River.
Great. Lisa, are you looking at the Q&A?
Yes, I am. But I had a question similar that kind of follows up to what Hava asked. Do we know what happened to those Jews? Did they assimilate into the culture, into those cultures and disappear? Or are we able to like draw links to their descendants practicing Judaism in those places today?
Right. Great question. Okay. So let's just talk about Rome. Or we have, by the way, Jewish communities in southern Italy from the same time period. I just didn't show it to you, but catacombs again. So the answer is almost undoubtedly yes. I mean, we enter into the quote unquote dark ages of Jewish history. We have so little material from the 5th to, let's say, the 9th century. But once we get more documentation emerging in the early Middle Ages, all these Jewish communities are still in the same places in Italy and in Cologne, in the Rhineland generally, in the 10th century to be sure. So you have to assume that these are the foundations of the later medieval Jewish communities which we know, that there would have been a continuity, that Jews were always in these places. And we talked about during the first break, the Romanio Jews of Greece, almost undoubtedly, right? One of the proofs for that, quote unquote proofs, as many of you may know, Italian Jews, the Sephardic Ashkenazic split happens early, middle of the Middle Ages, or 10th, 11th, 12th century, where you can really distinguish between Sephardic Jews or Mizrahi Jews, the vast majority of Jews, and the Ashkenazi Jews in what is today France and Germany, creating their own new liturgy and so on. To this day, the Italian synagogue service is different from both the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic. Mm-hmm. And that is an indication that their community, and they of course have those traditions, goes back to a time when there was a unique Italian ritual that they continue to use down to the present day. Does that answer the question?
Very.
And ditto for those Jews in Marseille. They must be the beginnings of the Jewish communities of Provence, which eventually emerge in Avignon and Arles and other places nearby. But we know they're Jews in Marseille already in the 2nd century.
Amazing. Okay. There's lots of questions. Okay. This person's asking about Jews in Britain, not then, right?
The Jews in Britain?
Yeah.
Right. There are no Jews in Britain until immediately after William the Conqueror, 1066. It'll take another almost millennium before Jews reach England. When William the Conqueror crosses from northern France into England and becomes the King of England, within a decade, he invited the Jews of Normandy to join him. And that's the beginning of the English community.
Okay. How many Jews were in these communities that you were talking about and in Israel?
That's the hardest question to answer. We have so little demographic information. I mean, people have attempted studies. Josephus gives us some numbers. It's just almost impossible to know. I mean, if I said several thousand in Rome, is that too many? If I said 100 in Cologne, what do we know? What do we know other than Constantine telling us that Jews could serve on the city council? One grave in Pannonia, right? It's just almost impossible to know. I mean, the Dura community must have been a sizable one. It's a pretty good sized synagogue. The Ostia Antica synagogue is a pretty good sized synagogue. You add up all those tombstones. Oh, that's one way of doing it, right? You can add up the number of niches in all of the catacombs.
Right.
You'd be in the thousands if you added them all up. But by that point, you're also looking at, third, fourth, fifth century. They just kept, creating new niches. So it's not a snapshot of a single decade. It would be over time. I just don't know how to answer the question. I don't think anybody knows how to answer the question.
Okay. The next question is, what museum has the stone menorahs with the lulav and etrog found in Corinth that you showed?
I think they're in Athens, I think.
Okay.
I think they're in Athens. Yeah. And there may be a small museum in Corinth. I just don't know, but they're probably in Athens.
What mode of transportation was typically used for the common people? I don't know. What?
The common people?
That's what it said. I'm just
Well,
reading.
the common people walked.
That's right, their feet.
Look, of course, if you're going to traverse the Mediterranean, you have a boat. By their ships crossing the Mediterranean at all times. People still travel by donkey. To get to Cologne, depending on how you go, you might have to cross the Alps or get around the Alps. So, there's a horse would have been extremely expensive. I'm assuming, you were lucky if you had a donkey, and if not, you walked.
Okay. All right. This person asks, how do you know where these people, the Jews, came from? Like, how do we know where they're from in terms of Babylonia, Egypt? Like, how do we trace them?
Right. So, look, all Jews originate in the land of Israel. So, I mean, that's, demonstrable through DNA. I mean, we didn't need DNA to know that. But it's been proven by DNA. So you just have to assume that somehow they left the land of Israel at different times. Last week I showed 500 years prior to this, moving to Babylonia, to Egypt, right?
Yeah.
And then you jump forward the 500 or 600 years to what we did today. And, we know, of course, that they took slaves. The Romans took slaves, brought the Jews back to Rome. But if they're if there's a synagogue in Dura in the 2nd century, or in Sardis in the 2nd or 3rd century, I mean, they must have gotten there soon. They must have left Israel at the time. And this can be more or less proven archaeologically, because not the Galilee, which burgeons, but the area around Jerusalem is archaeologically poor following the year 70 as you move into the 2nd and 3rd century. The Galilee is very rich in archaeology. So you just piece it all together to create the narrative that we do.
Okay. The next question is do you think that Rome captured the Ark of the Covenant?
No, because there was no Ark in the Second Temple.
There we go.
The Ark existed in the First Temple. And when the Second Temple was built, there is never a mention in the Bible of an Ark in the Second Temple, and is not mentioned in any other sources, not by Josephus either. So, and the rabbis in the Talmud specifically, explicitly state that there was no Ark in the Second Temple. Now, by the time they're writing that, it's been destroyed by a few centuries, but they know the tradition that there was no Ark in the Second Temple. So no, the Romans would not have the Ark.
And this person's asking, I think you already answered this, but were Jews always in Judea and Samaria? I guess consistently were they there?
Yes. I mean, there would be times of less population because of outmigration, but there was never a time that there were no Jews in the area.
Last question I'm going to take for the night. Can the Christian biblical history of Paul and the places that he visited be considered Jewish history as well?
Absolutely. Good question. So at the first century, while the temple's still standing in the first century, Paul is visiting, I have to go back and remind myself, he's visiting communities. Not so much Paul, actually. Let me change that. The book of Acts is a better gauge because the book of Acts refers to synagogues and Jewish communities in various places outside the land of Israel. But when Paul's going, for example, to Corinth, as an example, or to Rome, these are probably Jewish communities who are becoming Christian at the time, and or former Roman pagans who are becoming Christian. Right? So I'm not a New Testament specialist. I'd have to defer to my New Testament colleagues. To whom is Paul specifically speaking when he visits these communities in Asia Minor, the Aegean, Rome itself? But I think the general answer is yes, you can use that as a gauge to knowing that there were Jewish communities in these places in the first century as well.
Great, thank you. Hava, you want to?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to the last question. Can you say something about how the legalization of Christianity by Constantine impacted the status of the Jews throughout the 4th century?
Yeah.
And that might shed some light why we have so little literary documentation from this period.
Right. So there will be a downturn in the legal status of Jews with the Christianization of the Roman Empire. There were fewer rights accorded to Jews than prior to that. Right? The Jews had more legal rights, we'll call it, under the Roman rule than they would under Christian rule. Now, this is a whole other topic of which I am certainly not expert. There are people much more expert in this, including my colleague at Rutgers, Paolo Tartikoff, who's expert on Jewish-Christian relations. But you will get various decrees about limitations to Jews and so on. Having said that, Saint Augustine, for example, certainly, is no friend of the Jews in his theological writings, but also opposes, forced conversion of Jews and things like that, or, terrorizing Jews.
Yeah,
but I speak as somebody who's, now I'm outside my field. Yeah.
But what I find so fascinating here that we always tell the story of this 3rd, 4th century, the focus on Babylonia, where the rabbinic academies are. And we don't pay attention to the action in Rome, but you changed the nature of the conversation by this.
And you're absolutely right. In the 4th century, the very same time period, starting in the 3rd, but certainly in the 4th century and the 5th century, the two or three great academies flourish in Babylonia, which is where the Babylonian Talmud comes from, right? And one of the reasons why the Talmud of the land of Israel, the so-called Yerushalmi, created in Tiberias, not in Jerusalem, one of the reasons why the Yerushalmi Talmud of the land of Israel was never really completed was because it petered out because of the Christianization of the land.
Yeah,
probably had a negative effect on the ability for the academies in Tiberias to flourish.
Yeah. And also, there's something to do with the decline of the patriarchate,
which comes to an end at the time. Comes to it.
425.
Yeah.
So this was fascinating, and we can't wait for 2 weeks when we're going to hear the story in Arabia. So unless we have more questions, I guess, Elisa, can you tell the people if they're going to have access to this lecture? Because I've seen several questions about it.
Sure. There will be an email sent to you tomorrow from Zoom that will say thank you for attending, or for the people who aren't attending, for those who missed it or missed a part of it. It'll say, we're sorry you missed us, but in that email will be the link to sign up for the lecture in 2 weeks and the link to access this lecture.
Wonderful. Thank you. So thank you very much, Professor Rendsburg. This was absolutely enlightening and very informative.
Thank you, Chava. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Yeah. Good night, everyone. Enjoy wherever you are.